is Sarah Donovan, and I'm really glad to get to share my passion for great teaching and learning with our students with you during this series of sessions that we've recorded for Impact. So normally we'd be together for a day in Mississippi, and it'd be a great time for us to spend time together, me getting to know you and you getting to know me. But in lieu of that, I want to begin by telling you a little bit about myself and my passions. I grew up in the United States and went to university to study mathematics. And shortly after university, I moved overseas to Chiang Mai, Thailand, to work in the finance office for the International Mission Board. And I did that for 2 years before I transitioned to working at Grace International School in Chiang Mai, Thailand, which was a school where all of the missionary kids went. And I started teaching middle and high school math, and I fell in love with being in the classroom. And so over the years, I've moved from place to place. From Thailand, I went to Singapore. From Singapore, I went to Shanghai, China, and I went back to Singapore then to work at the next school there in Singapore. And I've had a lot of fun over the years. And after teaching high school math, I transitioned into working in teaching and learning. Currently, I work in London, England as the director of teaching and learning at an international school here. So my passion is professional development and assessment. That's where you'll see me mostly with teachers having a lot of fun. I studied in graduate school curriculum and instruction before I went on to do a doctorate in educational instructional leadership. And so this is what I'm really passionate about, is great teaching and learning in classrooms every single day. So while I wish we were face to face, I do know that as you transition to your new school, what's going to be really important is setting the tone at the beginning of the year with your students, helping them to have a place where they feel loved, where they feel safe. And in the middle of this global pandemic, as you transition to a new place, I feel for you because I've just done that this last year. But as you go into your classroom, or as you go in as an administrator and you're caring for your faculty and staff, the most important thing that you can do is begin the year by thinking about relationships and what we need for relationships. And so that's what we're starting off today with. We're going to be talking about how you intentionally build community in your classroom and how you think about meeting students' social and emotional needs. I do want to begin though today by letting you know that this is not one size fits all. Each of our NIC schools has a unique group of students and a unique culture. And my experience working in Asia and now in the UK is going to be very different than that of some of you who are going to other parts of the world. And I love working with TCKs. I love working with them to discover who they are and what makes them unique. And we know that in addition to our schools having unique culture, every student is uniquely created by God. And that is one of the things that I absolutely love, is the wide variety of students that we get to work with in terms of background, in terms of families, in terms of their life experiences. And so I want to let you know that today I'm going to ask a lot of questions more than I might give you some answers. And it's because when you go into your new country, you need to really go in with an open mind. If you go in with preconceived notions of what your classroom is going to look like, I'm going to be really honest and tell you that really it's going to lead to this sense of disappointment and unmet expectations. So I'm asking questions today, and you shouldn't feel the pressure to answer them all today, but you should keep them in mind as you do transition to your new home and as you think about what your classroom is going to look like. Now, if you're an administrator, you may be feeling that this session is focused on teachers and the learning that's happening in their classrooms, and that's true. But I want you to consider that when we talk about the relationship between teacher and student, that's not much different than the relationship between you and your faculty and staff. And so as we talk about a lot of these things today, just shift your mind to think about, this is what we want it to feel like in a classroom, but how is this what you want it to feel like within your community of faculty and staff? Now, at various times during today's presentation, I'll intentionally pause from content and share briefly about an instructional strategy. This is one of the professional development strategies that I use regularly, and we call this triple track strategy because these are strategies that we use in planning professional learning with adults There are strategies that adults can use when you're working with your teams, and then there are strategies that teachers can use in the classroom with students. And so these strategies are ways to allow us to help process information. And I'm going to begin today with what I consider to be that first triple track strategy, which is setting objectives for our time together. And as a teacher, sometimes we do this for the unit, and then we do it also as well for our daily lessons. And I always like to have these on the board and be very upfront with colleagues or students about what our objectives are for the time that we have together. And so today we're going to be looking in this session at the importance of relationships in the classroom, looking at ways that you can provide stability and can help students through loss and transition, and then explain why these relationships are of such benefit to students, but also talk at the end about the need for boundaries outside of the classroom. Now in the next slide, I'm going to put a word up on the screen, and I want you to pause your video when you see that word, and I want you to write down the first 3 words that come to mind. So you can just jot them down on a piece of paper or on your computer, but I'm going to show the word, and I want you then to reflect on that word and put down the first 3 things that come to mind. There's no right or wrong answer. Known. So pause the video here, write down those words, and then when you're ready, hit play and come back to this session. So were all of the words that you wrote down descriptor words? Did you write down the name of a person? Did you write down a word that reminded you of a time you were made known or that you made someone feel known? If we were together, we'd spend our time looking at and reflecting on the variety of responses. But what I'm sharing with you here is the responses from last year's Impact participants. And so I'm going to ask you to take another moment to pause the video and read through some of the responses, and then hit play when you're ready to come back again. Understood, loved, belonging, familiar, comfort, love, security, seen, relationship, deep. These are only some of the words we can associate with what it means to be known. Now, back to my triple track strategy. The reason that I asked you to write down these words is because I wanted you to self-reflect. I wanted you to make prior connections. And by showing you the word known on the board, I was asking you to make connections to emotion, to what you already knew, to your schema about what it means to be known. So that way, as we begin now to talk about what it means to be known, you're able to relate to some emotion, to some experience, and be able to place what we're talking about to make it personal for you. So one more activity, I'm going to ask you for now to pause the video, and when you pause the video, please draw this T-chart on a piece of paper, and I want you to fill in this T-chart with words that describe what it means to be seen versus what it means to be known. There aren't any right or wrong answers, so go ahead, pause the video here to take some time to complete this activity, and then hit play when you're ready to come back. So let's consider some of the things you may have put under the seen column. So when we think about what it means to be seen, one way we can look at this is that we discern it visually. We physically see it happening. And oftentimes when we see something, it means we're being a spectator of, we're watching it from a distance. We're observing it without being in the midst of the situation. We're not able to affect the situation. So seen is something generally that we do passively, that we're watching. To be known, however, is developing a relationship, and that comes through meeting and spending time with others. We don't just get to know someone by observing them from a distance at a deeper or intimate level. And when we know someone, we're absolutely sure or certain of who they are, or of what they like, what they may not like, how they're going to react in different situations. And it's really important that we recognize here that being seen and known are very different. They feel very different to us. And so I want you to consider this question. What would it look like if every child in your school was known by an adult? How would that feel? What would that look like? And if you're an administrator, I want you to think here about what would it mean if every adult in my community was known, if every faculty member, if every staff member that I worked with was known, because we all want to be known. Recently, I was doing a training for an international school, and we were talking about what it meant to have inclusive teams. And one of the things that adults need to be able to answer in order to be engaged is, do I matter? If I can't answer the question of do I matter, then I'm not going to be engaged in the work. Now, being known is a huge part of belonging, and that's something Libby talked to you about as part of the re-engagement stage of culture shock. Our way of re-engaging is that we have to be known and we have to belong. And being known is where you or the child in your classroom are settled and can live in the present. And so as I transitioned to London this year, the first semester, the first year, like Libby has talked about, of transition is always going to be hard. And in the middle of a global transition, it was a whole different layer. And so first semester was hard. I went to work every day. We were actually in lockdown for part of it. And it was hard to get to know people. It was hard to find a place to be known. And I got really lucky that in second semester, we went into a total lockdown. We had to close school. But I had a colleague said, Sarah, why don't you come and stay with our family? And for me as a single person, that was a really big deal. And over the course of those 3 months together, I remember reflecting and telling my colleague, I said, what I've realized is that you are always going to know me differently than anyone else I work with, because we've lived together for 3 months. We've spent time together. We work together. We have fun together. And there's something about being known that settles you. And so when I walked away from that lockdown, it was with a very different sense of security and a different feeling of belonging in the job that I did, belonging in the community, because I had a place, I had a family that knew me. And for your students, they also need that sense of, do you know me? Can I be myself? Can I be myself no matter whether it's a good day or a bad day? Are you going to love me and accept me for who I am? So this sense of known is critical to belonging. Now, I understand I've spent a lot of time talking about being known as we begin this session, but it's because it's so critical to settling into a new class, into a new school, into a new country and community for both you and your students. So I want to talk now about some of the things that we need to consider in order for our students to be known. And as I said before, I'm going to ask you a lot of questions in this session without giving you a lot of answers. But as you prepare to move to your new school, I'm going to ask that you prayerfully consider these things as you begin to prepare for and transition into a new classroom or into a new role at your next school. I mentioned a moment ago that question of do I matter in the context of adults need to be able to answer that to be engaged. But if we're honest, it's the same for students. Students are asking that question too. Kids want to know, do I matter? Do you see me? Do you know me? And so one of the most important activities you can do at the beginning of the year with your students is developing norms for the classroom. And classroom norms are those guidelines, rules, or essential agreements. In your classroom, you're going to have students from many different backgrounds and cultures, and you're going to have students who come from different schools and families who may have different values, including what does classroom behavior look like? How do I respond to questions? And it may be that they have different norms or expectations of what that behavior looks like than you or your school community has. And so we have to consider, given our uniqueness, given the wide variety of backgrounds and experience that we all bring, how do we best collaborate together as a learning community? And your classroom norms encompass then how you work together as a group, how others are treated, how you respect one another, and how you listen to each other. That's really important. And your classroom norms may also include those routines such as how students turn work in, how they line up, what do they do to get work when they've been absent, etc. And so you need to consider what your norms are and how those are communicated to students. I always appreciate seeing colleagues spending time at the beginning of the year working collaboratively with students to develop those norms of behavior for the classroom. And some of the ways that you might do this is asking students, what makes you feel heard? How do we ensure everyone's voice is heard? What behaviors show respect to each other? You may also have those norms for turning in work and for how you begin class together and for what students should do when they're absent. And make sure those are really clear and accessible to all of your students. You're going to have to spend time in the first couple of weeks of school heavily emphasizing these norms. And while TCKs thrive on change, they also appreciate the safety of knowing what's expected of them and routines because they become familiar and safe. A few years ago when Nix opened its Oasis School in Kuala Lumpur, I was talking with a colleague, and when I saw her in August, her class had 6 students, and I saw her again in November, and her class had 10 students. And she talked about how she had to reestablish the classroom norms every time. When we welcome people into our community, they change the dynamic of our community, and that's a really positive thing because we want that diversity of view. But one of the things that you might consider when you have a new student come in is assigning them a classroom ambassador to help share the norms and guide them through the first week of school. Have them sit with that new student at lunch. I'd recommend choosing a student who's fairly well connected socially with other students and who can serve as a bridge for developing relationships for the new student. But you do have to train or teach students how to be the classroom ambassador, and you're going to need to follow up with that new student and that classroom ambassador to see how things are going. But the reason that I share this is because I can pretty much promise you that the group of students you begin the year with will not be the same group of students you end the year with. So you need to know how to introduce new students into your classroom and your routine. Libby traditionally ends her talk about TCKs by mentioning how you as a teacher also have opportunity to bridge relationships between students. And I was talking with an elementary teacher a couple of years ago, and we were talking about the difference between working at a school in your home country and working at an international school. And one of the things that this colleague said was that one of the most important things she does as a teacher in an international school is she helps create and engineer relationships between students. And while this quote came from an elementary school teacher, it's true regardless of whether you teach elementary school, middle school, or high school. So one of my favorite high school students I've worked with is Ivan. And if you were to meet Ivan, Ivan's American. Ivan plays American football. He has a mohawk. He's about 6'2", 6'3", and Ivan was the only American boy in his entire grade. As big of a kid as Ivan is, Ivan has an even bigger heart. And so Ivan would come up to you, slap you on the shoulder, kind of puff up at you in jest. And if you didn't know Ivan and you didn't know American culture, Ivan could be pretty intimidating. And so Ivan felt that he and another boy were really good friends, but the other boy had no clue what to make of Ivan, wasn't really a huge fan of Ivan because he thought Ivan was too casual in how he treated him, and he viewed Ivan to some extent as disrespectful and intimidating because of his cultural lens. So a music teacher noticed the tension, and he really began to work together with those two boys, and he'd say, "Hey, Ivan, have you thought about how someone might feel when you slap him on the shoulder to say hello?" And to the other boy, he said, "Hey, have you noticed that Ivan wants to be your friend and how he slaps you on the shoulder because he really likes you and that's his way of saying hello?" Be on the lookout for these moments where you can help be that relational and cultural translator between students and help them build friendships. So back to this idea of being known and belonging. Just like we all want to be known, we all want to belong. And every child in your classroom wants to be noticed, wants to be cared for, and they want a place to be accepted for who they are. And our job as educators is to provide them with that place where they really feel like they can belong. Now, in elementary school, kids tend to be super accepting. It takes time, but the student who's new is usually accepted into the classroom group fairly quickly. A couple years ago at ICS in Singapore, we were giving an admissions tour, and parents went into a second grade classroom, and our kids were always super curious when they had visitors. And so they began asking the parents questions about their child and was their child going to go to ICS. And one of the students looked at the parents and said, "Your child needs to come here because we can be their friend." And I love that. That's the story of our kids as third culture kids being accepting. They really enjoy meeting other students and spending time with them. And the honest truth is that one of the things I loved about being at ICS Singapore was that our kids were the most lovable, unique, and sometimes quirky kids you would ever meet. And a few years ago in elementary school, we had a student who decided in 5th grade that they were going to wear white gloves to school every day. So the teacher and principal asked the student about it. "Are you worried about germs? Do you not want to get your hands dirty?" And the student said, "No, I just like wearing them." So this teacher and the principal just rolled with it. And to be honest, if there's something I've learned in my years in education, it's that if it isn't inhibiting the learning or the well-being of that student or other students, just let it be. And in many places in schools I've worked in, that student would have been ridiculed by their friends to no end. But at ICS, ironically, other fifth grade students started wearing gloves, and it was a temporary fashion statement, which Singapore is a tropical island. There's no reason you would almost ever wear gloves. But the other elementary kids started wearing gloves to school too. And so it's this story of just kids being super accepting of what it means for kids to be able to be their unique selves and how their friends pick up on it. But it's also important to acknowledge that some of the clickiest kids I've worked with have been middle and high school international school students, and that sadly that doesn't include missionary and Christian kids. That sometimes it's our Christian students who can be the most cliquey, particularly if a new student isn't Christian or doesn't fit into the preconceived Christian mold. And by middle school, students normally have this good sense of you're different than I am, you're similar to who I am, and they'll usually click together with students who are similar to them. And we'll talk a little bit about how we respond to cultures that are different or similar to ours in our session on Culture Matters. But students click together, whether it's by nationality, by ethnicity, by language, or by religion. And like the story I've told you about Ivan, you have to help students navigate their cultural differences and help them see where they share things in common and bridge those relationships. So I would say it's important to be aware of the in crowd, which in Latin America, for example, being a part of the in crowd is super important. At school, it'll take a new student a little while to be accepted, but usually once they're accepted, that they're really just another person in the crowd, and that they all get along really well together. Watch that process of assimilation and see what it looks like for a student to be accepted into the classroom community. But that sense of belonging can sometimes cause other cultural issues as well. So for example, in some of our cultures, you'll have a student who stays out until 11 p.m. or midnight with his family because they went to a party or a dinner, and this might happen quite often, which means the student comes into class tired, the student hasn't done their homework. But it also goes back to that importance of being accepted in the culture and being a part of the in crowd for that child's family. For them, the relationship rules. And while we would think from perhaps our Western or American perspective, I would never keep my student out until 11 p.m. or midnight on a school night, for these families and these communities, that's much more important, and that trumps rules that we consider to be important about child rearing, because it's about being a part of the in crowd. It's about being a part of the family and the acceptance within that culture or community. So it's important to realize that what it looks like to belong looks different in different places and in different communities. But I would ask you to think here to consider, how do I express to a child that he or she belongs in my classroom, and how do they know they're safe with me in my classroom? Those are two questions that I would ponder. TCKs are highly relational, and as Libby's talked about, they sometimes skip this acquaintance phase and go straight to the friend phase. And because of this, one of the biggest worries for students on the first day is going to be, will I fit in? Will I make friends? They know they eventually will, but they're wondering, who am I going to eat lunch with today? And one piece of belonging for kids is knowing where to sit when they eat lunch. So what you would know about me is that I'm an introvert. But more than being an introvert, I'm extremely shy, and I'm probably one of the shyest people I know. The first time I worked in Singapore, I worked at a school that had high social expectations. There were a lot of happy hours and parties for faculty, and it just came with the job. And while I knew people, I hated going to these parties. And so I finally asked a friend if they would be my home base, where if I just needed somewhere to be, could I go and stand next to them with a drink in my hand if I found myself at this point I didn't have anyone else to talk to, or I was unsure or felt awkward in engaging in new situations? And I always knew that this friend and I would sit together if there was a served meal. But why did that matter? Because I was, as an adult, asking that same question of, who am I going to sit next to? Who's going to want to talk with me? It's that same feeling of, who am I going to eat lunch with? And when I worked in Shanghai, we had this problem at the school that we couldn't get kids off campus. Why? Because kids wanted to be with their friends. It also helped that we had unfiltered internet that was really fast, and so the kids would stay and play video games as long as we would let them. And so to solve the problem, we kept campus open until 7 p.m. each night in our common areas for students. Third culture kids come to school because of their friends. They want to spend time with their friends. And when I would ask third culture kids if they're looking forward to break, the answer I would generally get is no. And that's hard for us to fathom as adults because we're thinking, really? Like, we can't wait for the break. But students, these third culture kids, the reason that they say, no, I'm not looking forward to break is because they're not going to get to see their friends. And so, something else you want to consider is that when school and friendships aren't going well in a student's life, for a third culture student, generally their life overall probably isn't going well. And the reason I say that is because it's very likely that your third culture kids don't have a social outlet outside of school. School is that student's lifeline, and that's particularly true if you live somewhere where the student doesn't speak the local language or it's difficult to become part of the local culture. And so these students come to school because their friends are family to them. And so you want to be thinking about, how do I use that relational capital to my advantage in my classroom? So because students are highly social, they want to work together, and so encourage those opportunities for students to collaborate as much as possible. But also keep in mind that you need to provide options for students who want to work individually. There has to be a balance of that. One of our next teachers who worked in South America was sharing a few years ago about using positive peer pressure as a way of working with students. Because students wanted to be social, because they wanted to work together, she often used that as a reward for students rather than taking that time away, because that culture that she was in was very much about group mentality and being together. And so getting students' attention happened very quickly if she was able to leverage them working together as a reward. So that's just food for thought about thinking about, how do you use that relational capital to your advantage in the classroom. One of the most important things I've stressed with teachers since the beginning of this school year is this: relationships first, then curriculum. That's the message I've given over and over again this year to teachers. And oftentimes teachers are kind of a bit taken back because my job is teaching and learning and curriculum and assessment. But from day one, invest heavily in building relationships with students as well as building classroom community. Having the relationship piece is so important, especially if you have to make another shift to online learning at some point during the school year next year. Build the relationships, get to know kids, so that way when you may have to step away from being together in person as a community, you still have built that community and you can draw onto those relationships during that time. As Nick's schools, one of the most important distinctives is how you're investing in relationships with and knowing students. It's what we're really, really good at. And so, again, I just want to stress relationships first, then curriculum. One final thing I want to talk about when thinking about influences on social dynamics in your classroom is socioeconomic status. So when I lived in Singapore, it was very common for families to throw huge birthday parties. And by huge birthday parties, I mean that the parents would fly a friend, their child and 5 friends off for a spa weekend in another country, or they would rent out the trampoline park. They were huge birthday parties. And so families would often chip in together to buy a present, but chipping in meant that that group present could be $100 to $200 per family. And so I had friends that had 2 girls, and they'd let their girls choose 2 birthday parties a year to attend. 2. Because on a teacher's salary, that was really all they could afford. And this was even a school where the parents were doing really well and easily making 6 figures a year. But it was that for the family, the idea of what it meant to keep up with other families was really difficult. And Libby talks about how there are different categories of third culture kids, and those include business kids, diplomatic kids, military kids, some of your missionary kids or your NGO kids, and some students whose families might be immigrants to the country. In addition to that, your students also fall into a category of either they're local students, they might be students of local staff, you might have students of your expat faculty and staff, and then you're going to have expat students. And the most wealthy students generally come from the local student and the expat student group. And their parents work in different industries, and that impacts these students' socioeconomic status. You're going to have families who have businesses and work for large international businesses with these great salary packages. You'll have embassy families, but then you'll also have missionary families who are scraping by to pay tuition. You'll have your staff families. You'll have families who are from the host country. And so sometimes there's this inability to keep up with other families, and that can lead to social stress for students and also for faculty, because being a part of the in crowd is very important, particularly in some of our school cultures within the NICS community. And so be aware that there is a sometimes disparity because of class and socioeconomic status, even within your school. And if you have children, you really need to ask yourself what you can afford, because keeping up with other expat families likely isn't an option. So I'd encourage you and your spouse to have some discussion about setting boundaries, similar to what my friends did around the birthday parties, because you will encounter the fact that you are not at the top of the socioeconomic status ladder in the community in which you live, and that may impact what you or your students are able to do. So I've talked about some of the social implications of teaching third culture kids, and now I want to talk a little bit about the emotional implications of teaching third culture kids. So we're going to take a quick quiz here, and I promise no one's going to see your answers, but the question is, what is the biggest pressure facing your students at your new school? And there are 4 potential answers here. The first is the pressure to fit in or conform socially. The second is the pressure to fit in or conform spiritually. The third is the pressure to excel. The fourth is the pressure to take care of family or be family-centered. And so I'm going to ask you to pause here for a moment to consider the options, and then click play when you're ready to begin again. All right, so we're looking at these 4 pressures, and what do they mean? So this pressure to fit in and conform socially is that I want to be part of the in-group, that what is most important is that I fit in socially with other students. The second option is the pressure to fit in or conform spiritually. For the NICS schools where we are able to be open about our faith, oftentimes, like I mentioned previously, that for many of our students, they come from Christian families, and that's the expectation, that's the norm of the community. And so there's a pressure to fit in and conform and to be a good Christian. The third pressure is the pressure to excel, and that generally is shown academically, that there's an expectation that I'm going to do well, that I'm going to perform well in school. And the fourth pressure is the pressure to take care of family and be family-centered. And all of these link together. Now, I'm not going to give you the answer immediately, but I am going to come back to this question in a moment. So let's talk about some of the pressures that your students are facing. And to provide perspective, let's think about who the parents of your students are. They're high-achieving parents. Students are at your school because their parents have goals. And sometimes those goals are mission-oriented, sometimes they're business-oriented. But your students' parents are high achieving, generally excellent at what they do, and used to high levels of success, whether that's from a Christian missionary perspective of planting churches, whether that's from a perspective of working in a business industry, whether that's working in an embassy or diplomatic type situation. Your students' parents have goals, and they're very successful at meeting those goals. So high achieving parents are going to have high expectations for academic success for their students, and they expect that you're a professional expert teacher of not only students, but of third culture students. Many of your students' parents fear failure, and the fear of failure isn't unique to the parents. The students also pick up on those fears and then take on those fears for themselves. Parents of TCKs are also generally confronted with a feeling that they've failed their own children. Because remember, they've moved their children halfway across the world. They've changed the experience that their child is getting. Sometimes they see the emotional toll the moving takes on the child, but they feel like they don't have control over the move. And so parents may feel like they've failed their children. You also need to consider the child may feel like they've failed meet the parents' expectations, and the child may feel like the child is failing the expectations they've set for themselves. So you need to consider what failure looks like and how you address failure in your classroom. And I'm not talking about failure just being an F on an assignment. So as you consider how you define failure and how you approach failure, you need to teach students that mistakes are valued in your classroom, that none of us are perfect, and that making mistakes or not meeting expectations every time is okay. And that's a really difficult lesson for students to learn as well as for us to learn as adults. But what we know more and more about brain research is that making mistakes is what allows our brains to learn and grow, whether we're aware of those mistakes or not. And so I think about oftentimes when I think about how do we define failure and how do we teach students that mistakes are valued in the classroom from this perspective of a student named Edwin. Edwin was the first student that I had cry. And the reason I tell that is because 6 weeks in, it was my first year as a teacher, Edwin was failing AP Calculus. And at that point, in looking at what he had done so far, it was obvious that after those 6 weeks, Edwin was not going to be able to catch up. And the hardest part about this discussion was that Edwin needed AP Calculus to apply for pilot school. This was his parents' expectation, was that Edwin was going to become a pilot. This was Edwin's expectation. The parents' expectation of Edwin had become Edwin's expectation, and now Edwin wasn't going to meet it. And so all of a sudden, you have a student who feels like he's failing his parents, who feels like he's failing himself, when in fact the discussion that we could have is how do we learn from this? What other pathways are there that we can go? But it's that sense of I'm failing my parents, I'm failing myself, that's really hard on students. And so navigating that discussion of being able to shift what it means to fail, this idea of failing forward, that I can learn from my situation, is really important. And for many of our students and families, that's actually not something that they're used to. And so it's a shift of framework, it's a shift of reference. And so when we think about how we define failure, what parents' expectations are, what students' expectations are, this is really important to be thinking about. How do I talk about growth rather than failing? And how do I reframe an opportunity of failure to be an opportunity for growth and perhaps looking at different pathways? So back to my question about the pressure facing your students. And the honest truth in my perspective is that the biggest pressure facing your students is that pressure to excel. Now, all 4 of these pressures are actually pressures that students will face in your school. So it's kind of like a trick question. But the biggest pressure reported by third culture kids is the pressure to excel. And it transcends but can also encompass culture, religion, and social expectations. Can I excel socially? Can I excel at being the best Christian possible? Can I excel to get into a good university because that's going to be how I take care of my family? So there are some really big pressures facing your students. Now, I've been talking about triple track, and generally this is a point, rather than taking a quiz, I would take a class poll. And I like taking polls because it's fairly low risk and requires students to be up and moving, because I'll say, all right, if you choose question 1, go to this corner. If you choose option 2, go to this corner. If you choose option 3, go to this corner. If you choose option 4, go to this corner. And I do this because it gives me a gauge for where students are at as I begin instruction. I also look for questions where all 4 answers are actual possibilities. And like I mentioned, for this question, all 4 of these are pressures students face. There's not a wrong answer, but I will look for best or biggest answers instead. Then we discuss why people choose their answers and what the best answers might be. Now, there are going to be some unique challenges for new students. At Impact, we talk a lot about transition, and so I want to talk a little bit about those unique challenges for new students when we talk about what it means to excel. So at this point, I've worked in 5 very different international schools, and these challenges are challenges that have been true in every school. And as I've talked to teachers from schools around the world, they've also noticed these challenges. So international school students could be entering your school from homeschool. from a school from their passport culture, from another international school, and all of those can have very different curricula. Even two American curriculum schools may have very different approaches to learning if one offers, for example, an IB curriculum and the other is an AP school. So if a student has moved many times, they're guaranteed to have some gaps in their learning because of the different type of education and systems. And so I want you to pause and think for a moment, what content do you believe will give your students the most trouble in your classroom? So pause, think about that, and then hit play when you're ready to come back again. Now, the reason that I ask you to consider what content will give students the most trouble in your classroom is because, again, I want you to consider that students, when they come into the international school classroom, have not always had a consistent program of instruction that's going to meet what we offer at the school that you're at. Now, what I will say is that, particularly if you teach in a self-contained classroom, where you teach all of the subjects, or if you teach middle and high school math, the class that I have found year over year is that your students will struggle the most with math. Many students who have moved around will have holes in their math education because we take very different approaches. How we teach math in a U.S. Common Core context is very different from how we teach it in some other parts of the world. And some cultures emphasize computation while other cultures emphasize deeper understanding of mathematical concepts from a theoretical perspective. And so what I can tell you is that regardless of what you teach, you're going to have to be able to backfill content for students. And so you need to be thinking about, how do I build a base foundation at the beginning of the year? Or how do I perhaps catch new students up when they come in mid-year? In Singapore, our 4th and 5th grade students learned the recorder, and we did this thing called recorder karate, where kids earn different colored belts as they progress to harder songs. And one of the students was having a conversation with her mom about how she was still at the beginning color, but everyone else was 3 or 4 levels ahead. And her mom, with her best intention, commented to her and said, "Well, honey, it's just music. That's okay." And the daughter replied, "Mom, that might be how it is for adults. You may not care about music, but that is not about how it is for us kids." And so you need to know that in international schools, for many of your students, straight A's aren't the exception. They're the norm, and they are expected by the families. One of the hardest things for new students to adjust to is the level of academic rigor and the expectation and level of work required for an A, and dealing with what happens when they don't meet that A. So as a teacher new to international teaching, if this is your first time moving overseas, you're going to have to re-norm in your mind your expectations for student achievement and what that looks like. And that leads me to my last point here, which is about what does it mean to be low achieving? When I work with teachers internationally, I often hear them talk about students being low. And when you go and look at the data, these students aren't low. The catch is that we in international schools oftentimes have a student population that is skewed and is very, very, very high achieving. This goes back to the fact that parents have high expectations of students. Students have high expectations of themselves, and that straight A's are the norm. They're the expectation. And so when we consider the idea of students who are low, I would beg of you, when you look at the students in your classroom, we don't talk about students as being low, because oftentimes these kids are average or even above average in the United States. We just have a very skewed population. And it's really important that students who we might perceive as struggling within our program are struggling because the academic program we're offering is so much higher than that they might have in the United States or in a different program. So it's important to keep that perspective in mind. It's also important to realize every student has strengths. And so for students who do struggle internationally in academics, they're going to have other strengths. Help them find those strengths and help them develop those passions, while also helping scaffold your instruction for them to be able to succeed. As we continue talking about emotional issues, when Libby talks about 3 TCK issues, one of those issues she talks about is loss. And we can't talk about the emotional implications for teaching third culture kids and not talk about loss. And as I said earlier, you shouldn't expect that you're going to begin the year with the same group of kids that you will have at the end of the year. You will have new students come in, but you will also have students leave, and you always have to be ready to lose a student. Sometimes kids will know in August it's their last year at the school and they have to live with this impending feeling of loss for the entire year. But sometimes parents hide from a student that they're going to be leaving until the very last day of that child's time at school, which is a horrible approach, but some parents do it because they think they're protecting their student. So you always have to be ready to say goodbye to a valued member of your community. And it's not uncommon that at the end of the year, you're going to hear both students and adults saying goodbye to each other and feeling very similar emotions in their loss. And so you may wonder why I'm talking about loss before we even begin the school year. We're talking about loss here because it can happen at any point. You can lose students in the first couple of weeks of school. But for us as adults, when we say goodbye, it's the same sense of loss that students feel. And as we talk about saying goodbye in this COVID era, you need to understand that in many of the schools you're going to this next year, those students haven't said a proper goodbye to their friends at the end of this year. The faculty and staff you're joining may also not have gotten the opportunity to say goodbye to their parents, students, and colleagues and faculty. Everyone globally is processing grief and loss right now. And when I moved last year from Singapore to London, the phrase that I used was profound loss, because I hadn't gotten to say goodbye to some of my colleagues. I hadn't gotten to say goodbye to some of my favorite students that I had worked with and that I had developed relationship with. And so it's important to recognize that loss is when we are leaving, but loss isn't just when you're leaving. Loss can also be when you're staying and the people close to you are leaving. I think about, I had one year when I lived in Shanghai, everyone I was close to left. And it led to the sense of, it's just me that's left. And that's a hard sense of loss too. So you can feel loss when you're leaving. You can also feel loss when you're staying. And these are two sentiments you're going to hear parents talk about at the end of the year, that their student is having a hard time because their best friend or all of their friends are leaving. And so keep in mind as you come into this school year that you have colleagues and students who are still processing loss. But how do we say goodbye? How kids say goodbye isn't that different from adults, like I said, in terms of the emotions we feel. But as adults, when we're not living in the midst of pandemic, we have control over how we say goodbye, and kids don't always have that same control. So you'll see an increase in broken friendships and kids pulling away from adults and students when they're leaving in April and May. And Libby talked about how we begin to disengage from those around us. Kids aren't immune to that same habit. Whether we're able to put words to it or not, we sometimes feel it's easier to be mad at someone and leave upset and break the friendship than it would be to go through the emotions of saying goodbye. We also question sometimes whether it's worth trying to repair a relationship when you're leaving. But as a teacher, you have to be prepared to help students say goodbye at any time. So how do you do that well? I think there are some really simple ways to do that are meaningful. I love words of affirmation, and so some teachers I know will take class time and spend time sharing words about a student, and everyone will share words of affirmation about that student. And I like it even better when that's written into a card and a student can take that with them, or it's videotaped and the student can take that video with them so they can see their friends talking about how much they're loved and being affirmed. It's also worth having class photos on hand, and particularly if you teach in a elementary school self-contained classroom, every time a new student comes, go out and take a new photo. Every single time on that student's first day or second day, you go out and you take a new class photo. And the reason you do that is you want to have a couple of copies of that photo on hand. Because if a student leaves, you want to be able to hand them a photo of the class and the community. And so I recommend always having a couple copies of that photo on hand. And bonus points if you glue it to some matting and let classmates write their names or notes of encouragement around the photo. Some teachers like having just a t-shirt on hand where all the kids can draw or write that the departing student can take with them. But it's always worth acknowledging the loss in your community. As Christians, we know each person has inherent worth and value, and each person brings something special to the community. When our community experiences loss, it's uncomfortable and it can hurt. But it's important to always remember that it's healthy to experience those feelings and to send students a message that feeling that sense of loss and discomfort is healthy. And so when you arrive in a new school, I'd encourage you to ask your colleagues, what are the transition rituals when students leave, regardless of whether it's at the end of term or at any other time. But finding out how we say goodbye is really important. The last emotional piece I'll talk about here is stability. And as we mentioned earlier, TCKs know how to deal with change, but you can't underestimate the importance of stability in students' lives for the time they're with you, whether they're with you for a semester or they're with you for 14 years. And so I'd encourage you to think about how you provide stability in students' lives. What is predictable in your classroom? We talked earlier about routines and norms, but how else can you provide stability? School is a comfort zone for third culture kids, even more so sometimes than home, because oftentimes for third culture kids, one parent is traveling regularly, and you'd be surprised by the number of students who will even have both parents traveling regularly and are often left perhaps with just the helper. And so you provide stability for these kids. They look up to you and they want to know that you're there for them. Now, what I love about Nix is that we do kids' relationship well. It's what we're really good at. And this is where you truly learn to know a child, is through the activities and through the opportunities of working with them outside of the classroom. Within our network, one of the hallmarks of what we do best is that we invest in kids' lives. So I want to talk briefly about building relationships beyond the classroom walls, because like I just said, you provide stability in these kids' lives, and you're going to be involved with them in activities that don't only occur just between the school day. Part of the realization as an international school educator is going to be that your job is more than a 7:30 to 4 o'clock job. You provide some social and emotional support to these students, and it's a huge part of your job. But there are some other things that you need to consider. Before I started teaching, I worked as a journeyman in the IMB finance office, and so my relationship with kids was as Aunt Sarah, because they used the honorifics aunt and uncle, and Aunt Sarah hung out with you, she took you shopping or out to eat, she babysat. Aunt Sarah did a lot of fun things. But once I started teaching and I had these students in my class, I was Miss Donovan in the classroom. I was still willing to be Aunt Sarah outside of the classroom when we weren't at a school event, but my rule has always been that until a student graduates or leaves the school, I always expect that they use some sort of honorific. And so now, whether it's Coach Donovan, whether it's Dr. Donovan, whether it's Aunt Sarah, I always expect that there's something that you're using as an honorific when you address me. And it's a boundary that I'm an adult in the relationship and that I'm not a friend. For those of you who are younger, especially in your early to mid 20s, you have to be really intentional about setting that boundary. I do let it change after graduation that they call me by my first name. And that's when I would let them friend me on social media. But do not friend your students on social media. Do not just let your kids call you by your first name. You have to set good boundaries. You also need to remember that if you're going to meet with a student outside of school, you need to have parent permission and have it in writing form. And so if you're meeting with a student outside of the school hours, write the parent and make sure that they know and that they're okay with that. It's about protecting the child, but it's also about protecting you. One thing you need to be aware of is that when you're building relationship with students, you need to avoid exclusivity and the possibility of perceived favoritism. So if you're going to run a Bible study for 11th grade girls, you need to run it for 11th grade girls, not for your just 2 or 3 of them that approached you and were interested. Make sure that the invitation is extended to everyone. You want to avoid perceived favoritism. I once had a parent call me to invite me to their house for the student's birthday dinner, and that's not uncommon. And this was a student who was shy and they were struggling socially. And I'd been working with the student to develop trust in the class and to invest in relationship with the student. And I had been over to their house for dinner before, but as I spoke with the mom about the invitation for the student's birthday dinner, the mom had told me that they weren't going to have a party. It was just this dinner because the student was struggling with an eating disorder. And I thanked the mom. I told her I'd be happy to be at the birthday celebration and to please let me know what time, what I could bring, etc. But in that moment, I also had to make a really difficult decision to go and speak with the student's guidance counselor and let her know that the student was struggling with that eating disorder, because I knew the student's health and safety came first, and that was beyond the scope of how I could support the student. That the student and family needed help I couldn't provide. So you have to know when you're working with kids and you're developing relationship what the boundaries are, but also when you need to know to go get help. If you're supporting a student, you can't promise confidentiality. You can't promise to keep secrets. You have to know when to get help. What we discovered was that this student was also cutting and had some other issues and needed significant help. And the best way that I could support that student was by reaching out to get help from someone who could better help the student and was qualified to provide that help. So I don't tell you that to be a downer, but to remind you that you have to be the adult in relationship with students. You're not your student's friend. You need to have healthy boundaries with students, and you need to maintain a bit of distance. So supporting students socially and emotionally does not mean taking on the role of peer or friend, but it does mean that you can be there to support them. Investing in those relationships is important. The investment you're making is an eternal one. And I want to end by asking you the same question I asked at the beginning. What would it look like if every student in your classroom or school was truly known by an adult or by you as an administrator? You get the opportunity to know these kids outside of the classroom. At ICS in Singapore, it was very common to see our teachers sitting with kids after school in the hallway and just chatting about life. And that's where you get to ask questions and dig deeper. It happens outside of the classroom. And many times when you ask kids how it's going, the first response you won't get is the true answer. To an American, when we say, hey, how's it going? The expected response is, it's good. A TCK might respond with more info saying, I'm busy right now, but I'm good. And it's worth digging to find out more. Ask students, so it's good. What's making it good right now? Or you're busy, so why are you busy right now? What support do you need? It's worth digging to find out more. And that's how you begin to get to have those deep discussions about life and faith and where God is working in students' lives. And it's where you learn kids' passions and aspirations and dreams. So invest in kids and invest in relationship. At ICS in Singapore, our mission tagline was educating minds and transforming lives. And that's what we do at Nick's schools every day. You are educating minds, you are teaching them in the classroom, but you also have the amazing opportunity to support kids and transform their lives and play a part in the work the Holy Spirit is doing in their lives. So dig deeper, invest, and build relationship with those kids. So in this session, we've talked about the importance of relationships in the classroom, your job in helping engineer those relationships, as well as how TCKs are highly relational. We've talked about how you can provide stability in the classroom, thinking about some of the fears and expectations students experience, as well as how you can help students through loss. And we've talked about the benefits of relationships, that importance of being known, and we've touched briefly on why we have to have boundaries, and those are important. So over the course of this session, at various points, I've talked about those triple track strategies, and my last one is this. At the end of the day with students, you always want to be able to summarize the day's work and have students reflect on their learning. And so I always review my learning objectives at the end of a session with teachers or with students to make sure I've covered everything for the day. So finally, I want to leave you with 3 reflection questions that you can consider. Sometimes as a teacher, I'll collect the reflections, sometimes I won't. But as we end our time together in this session, there are 3 things I'd ask you to reflect on. What are some of the preconceived expectations you have of what teaching in your new classroom and school will be like? think through that, because like I mentioned, sometimes those preconceived expectations are only going to lead to disappointment. Also, how do I welcome a student into my class? What does their first day look like? And how does my class say goodbye to a student? So I'm really glad that I've gotten to share this session with you. There are 2 other sessions, one about culture, one about international school curriculum, and I look forward to seeing you there. Have a great afternoon.